Hello and welcome to the Politics and Government panel here at the Oil and Gas Conference. We are very pleased to have with us Ambassador Christopher Hill, Elizabeth Ames Coleman, and Kathleen Scama with us to help shed some insight and perspective on both domestic politics and government policy, as well as the international view as it relates to oil and gas. We're going to kick this panel off with some introductory remarks from each of our panelists, and then we'll be going into some Q&A. To start us off is Ambassador Christopher Hill. Christopher, love to have you give us a little bit of background and your opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much. And let me just say what a great pleasure it is to be on this panel with these distinguished panelists. I must say, though, it's not a great pleasure to really talk about what's going on in the world because there are really more than the usual unknowns. And I would just like to start with the two unknowns that I think most people worry about in the world. Certainly people outside the US worry about them. And the first is, of course, how long is COVID-19 going to go on? Are we going to be in a second phase? Are we already in a second phase? Will there be more phases? What will be the course of the vaccinations? Who will be first? How will they be allocated around the world? Just mind-numbing questions like that, and questions which really go to the heart of the world economy. We saw China kind of bouncing forward a couple of months ago, and now there's a lot more concern about where world growth is going, and it has to do with COVID. And I must say the world kind of looks at the United States, which has always been an engine of growth. The world has perhaps depended on the US, perhaps more than it should. Certainly that's the view of many Americans, but when you look at what is going on in the US with continued problems and confronting this public health issue, there are a lot of people in the world who are very worried about it. And that brings me to the second enormous unknown, and that is, how long is this Trump administration going to be in office? Without getting into the US politics of it, I will say quite honestly, and I think for a largely American audience, it's important to understand that many countries in the world are quite frantic and quite worried about the decision-making processes that go on within the US government these days. And in particular, there's a concern about where the Trump administration is really hoping to go in its China policy. I think it's fair to say that every 4 years in the United States, when we have elections, we also have a pretty thorough time of sort of China bashing. But this time, there's something very different about it. It's gone well beyond the usual. And there's a lot of talk about decoupling now. There's even talk about possibly denying China access to the dollar world out there. Chinese economists are worried about this. They're thinking, if there's a COVID vaccination, for example, should they be providing this vaccination to the world in renminbi and demanding renminbi in place of dollars? A lot of huge questions. Most Americans, I think, missed out on the issue that came up very early on in 2017 when the Trump administration decided it was not going to take part in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And that was probably a much more important decision than many people thought at the time. Even the opposition candidate at the time, Hillary Clinton, said that she wasn't ready to sign off on TPP. So the US basically made a decision about that, a rather fateful decision because it kind of put China very much in the game. So when you look at in the game in terms of in terms of certainly regional dominance, but also in terms of its capacity to lead. So while we see all these real unknowns coming to bear, there's still another unknown, which is how will China react to this kind of pushing and shoving the U.S. has been engaged in. We heard our Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, the other day saying the world needs to kind of reform China. China doesn't look at it at all that way. And so you can see in Southeast Asia, where there are some countries very worried about China's behavior in trying to turn the South China Sea into a southern Chinese lake, very concerned about that. Countries like the Philippines and Indonesia and Malaysia. Other countries are less affected by it, therefore maybe less concerned whether the U.S. is actually retreating. Because again, another huge unknown in the Trump administration is the degree to which the Trump administration believes that U.S. leadership is desirable and necessary in the rest of the world. So just looking at the issues of East Asia, we can see a lot of big questions. And I think the Chinese are kind of betting and hoping, in fact, if you saw some of the analysis last week in the U.S. intelligence agencies, kind of hoping that maybe there'll be a new administration. But meanwhile, you have over on the other side of the world, you've had this extraordinary development, which started in April, although its antecedents go way before that, and that was the Russian-Saudi reaction to the oil glut. Well, there's been a bit of a ceasefire as we get into August. I think both countries have kind of adjusted to keeping the supply low and therefore the prices high. But I think the country that will probably blink first is Russia. Their companies are much more concerned about market share than Saudi Arabia is. Saudi Arabia is also less concerned about the course of the dollar because in Russia's case, they denominate in rubles, they pay their workers in rubles. The Saudi case is they're just an extension of the dollar zone. So a very different attitude. And this kind of tentative ceasefire that's gone on between Russia and Saudi Arabia, very unclear how long that will last. Now that's an area where President Trump actually did get directly involved. You know, he's very reluctant to kind of push himself into these international issues, but he did get directly involved in that to try to boost oil supplies. So we'll have to, or I'm sorry, to bring up the oil price. So we'll have to see whether that plays out. So a lot of questions, far more questions than I have answers for. And certainly I think for all of us, we're going to have to stay tuned because there could be some real clutchless shifts in how this world economy goes forward. So with that opening burst, perhaps I'll join the Q&A session.
Thank you, Ambassador. And you certainly gave me plenty of additional questions. So we'll see what kind of time we have on it. But you raised a lot of great questions. Our next presenter is Elizabeth Ames Coleman. Elizabeth, love to hear your thoughts and opening comments for our panel.
Thank you, Dan. It's great to be with you and everybody today. Even though we're not connected as I was the last time I spoke at an Intercom oil and gas conference in Denver a few years ago. And I enjoyed that very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to be invited back. I must have minded my manners, and I like the opportunity to be here, especially with this group, Kathleen, who brings her grassroots know-how. And as president of the Western Energy Alliance, myself as a former statewide elected official in Texas, serving on the Texas Railroad Commission for 7 years, after a stint in the Texas House for 4 years. And more importantly, I guess what I bring is a perspective as an oil and gas operator, being born and raised in a family of oil and gas producers, domestic oil and gas and independent producers. Then I've been an elected official overseeing this industry that I had actually grown up in. And then in my post-government years as a policy advisor with Patton Boggs in Washington, D.C. for a couple of years, and then joining my husband in Energy North America, our boutique energy consulting and research firm, I bring a perspective that is sort of connects a lot of the different levels, if you will, and interests. And my trips to UAE and Dubai, Qatar several times since 2009 has given me some perspective on that part of the world and our relationships with them and how they affect what actually goes on at the drill bit back in the Permian Basin in Texas, and or the Eagle Ford Shale and these natural gas plays in Texas. And, you know, what do the frackers need and want, and how does what the young prince of Saudi Arabia, how is what he is doing affecting them, and you know, what goes on in their home lives. And I think it's a fascinating dynamic where the smallest independent oil and gas producer is actually connected in some way to someone so far away that they know so little about. And so I look forward to these discussions and these questions related to geo-global politics. I look forward to hearing the ambassador. We talked a little bit about that in our prep session last week on what is going on around the world and in the Middle East, and how Trump has been dealing with the Middle East, which in my my very strong opinion based on research and gut as well, knowing full well that OPEC and the Saudis were out of compliance with World Trade Organization rules and regulations, and they were dumping on the world stage and driving the price down. And I do believe that the U.S. American domestic producer was not collateral damage, that they were the intended target. But, you know, it came off looking like, oh yeah, we just didn't mean to be hurting our great friends. And the president got involved lightly with a very light touch, which he doesn't use with China, but he got involved. And I think what we saw today is the outcome of why he used such a light touch in the spring on the Saudi producers and the production and the lack of lack of compliance with World Trade Organization rules by dumping their crude oil below market price on the world stage. So I'm excited to be here and look forward to answering these questions and asking some of my own, and hope that I can shed some light on some of these dynamics that influence and affect our own homegrown domestic oil and gas industry.
Elizabeth, thank you so much. The great comments, great opening comments. Certainly, those are going to be some topics that we're able to cover in the Q&A. Our next panelist, Kathleen Scama, is president of the Western Energy Alliance, and certainly look forward to your participation, Kathleen.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate being on. And Elizabeth, agreed completely. We were definitely the target of that whole Russia-Saudi war. Anyway, I'm Kathleen Scama, the president of Western Energy Alliance. We represent oil and natural gas producers in the Western Rocky Mountain states. We are a nonpartisan organization that represents producers on environmental, regulatory, policy issues, public affairs. But it's hard to be nonpartisan when we're facing a potential Biden-Harris administration who do things like talk about banning fracking and banning leasing on federal lands. So, you know, but we're not surprised. We've been planning for this for the last couple of years. All of our advocacy has been directed at a potential switch in administration to a Democratic administration. That's something we, would have to do. We always kind of plan for various scenarios. So we have been undertaking a three-pronged approach. And that is, first of all, it's all designed to make as many of the energy positive policies, those energy dominance policies of the Trump administration, as permanent as possible. So we have a three-pronged approach. First of all, robust regulatory engagement. There are several very significant rules that only a Trump administration would have the guts to go and try and undertake. We all heard about George W. Bush being an oilman, but frankly, his policies were very tepid because he didn't want to really take on some of the big issues. So, but Trump, being the bull in the china shop, has been willing to take some bullets over his policies because he knows that deregulatory agenda, though it can be, it's spun very negatively in the media, is really what's underpinning that huge economic growth that we saw during most of the Trump administration. So we have robust regulatory engagement. And then the second approach is very much legal. So the environmental lobby has unlimited funds to sue everything that could possibly be beneficial to the oil and natural gas industry. And we have seen that in spades. They will continue that. So we've had to have a robust legal strategy as well. And I'm happy to talk about that if we get into it. But we're basically defending every federal lease since 2015. They're basically have, and the only reason it's only since 2015 is because of the statute of limitations. And there are some other rules that we managed to stop federal regulation of fracking, and we are engaged on methane rules as well. And there's a major EPA announcement on that within the last hour. So happy to talk about that. And so, and then the third approach is political. I mean, we work on both sides of the aisles to get as many favorable politicians into roles where they make decisions. And that includes members of the Democratic Oil and Gas Caucus in the House, those Texas Democrats, Bakersfield, California Democrats, Joe Manchin in West Virginia. I mean, there are moderates that will help to blunt the most radical Green New Deal aspects that would come out of the House without those moderates. So that's kind of our three-pronged approach and how we're trying to make as many of the energy dominance policies as permanent as possible. And one final note that kind of ties into what Chris and Elizabeth were talking about on more of the global stage is we've been very active in LNG exports. When we look at it with all the associated gas from oil wells, about the only new source of demand for Rockies natural gas would come from LNG export. And so we've been very active on the Jordan Cove terminal, which just had its final license approved this last month. After first applying in 2012, we can probably talk about some of the litigation that surrounds any kind of infrastructure project. But when we look at some of the rules that we hope to get done during the Trump administration, some of those will impinge on the ability to get that infrastructure in place, like LNG exports. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to questions as well.
Thank you very much, Kathleen, and excited to kind of jump into the Q&A. I will throw this out, and I say this somewhat tongue in cheek. Does anybody want to make a prediction on the November elections? Do it now.
Way too volatile.
What's that?
Way too volatile.
Exactly. Well, here,
although I would say that I still think the Senate flipping is probably not going to happen, especially when you see all of these push polls coming out on Biden that are trying to make him seem inevitable. I think that is going to drive more people to go, I kind of like split government. And so it could help out some Republican senators.
Sure. I did say that intentionally tongue in cheek. I know that all of our crystal balls, as we found out over our lifetime in oil and gas and public, as Mr. Ambassador, kind of the international policy and relations, sometimes our crystal balls are terribly cloudy. However, we can talk about kind of the first scenario is, what does U.S. domestic oil and gas policy look like if President Trump wins and maintains a Republican control in the Senate? What does energy policy look like? And I'll throw it, Kathleen. You kind of kicked us off a little bit with some of that idea. Why don't we get your comments, and then we'll go around to the ambassador and to Elizabeth and see what their thoughts are on that.
Well, I think if there is a second Trump administration, that gives them time to get through all of the litigation. And so I'm not sure exactly, I'm sure there'll be new proposals and new rules that they might tackle, but I think more importantly is they would be able to solidify all of the litigation. Right now, it's almost meaningless what happens at the district court level. Anything is going to be appealed. And so it's really the circuit courts that are going to make decisions on pipelines and on, NEPA reform and some of the very important things. And even some of those will go up to the Supreme Court. I think the Supreme Court has been kind of itching to take on this notion that a judge in Montana can rule on a transnational pipeline that doesn't even touch the state of Montana. I think that judge is really begging to be overturned and have that even go up to the Supreme Court. I mean, it's embarrassing when the Supreme Court has to come in and clean up your ruling, which stopped all 404 permits for everything in the entire country. So I think that the Supreme Court is itching to take that up specifically since Kavanaugh is such a regulatory guru.
Yeah, I see that, and we see this where we have a lower court ruling that provides an injunction that's national, and then it's then that stay is put in place and litigated out. I agree with you that maybe the Supreme Court kind of needs to hash that out. Mr. Ambassador, I want to ask you, given a Trump win and control of the Senate, I know yours is more of an international view. How does that look for U.S. domestic energy on an international stage under a kind of the way things are now?
Well, I can certainly speak for various U.S. embassies out there and what our policies are in terms of export promotion, and I would assume that there would be a real effort to help exports. I realize there are regulatory issues back at home, but from a foreign policy point of view, I think it's in the U.S. interest to try to do more in terms of the clearing up the regulatory climate. One point I'd like to make on the issue of fracking, I could be wrong, and what we say today may be little remembered, long forgotten, but I don't see Joe Biden as being an anti-fracking guy. He obviously is going to have a lot of issues to deal with on the left, but when I see that Ocasio-Cortez, the AOC, has but 1 minute in the Democratic Party convention, 1 minute to give her speech, I am not quite sure that I would go along with the view that the Democratic Party has been hijacked and become an extreme leftist organization. That said, Biden has been quite clear about his belief that we need to do more in terms of renewables, and I think you would see a big push in the U.S. to try to work with other countries on that, try to make sure that China doesn't lead the world in solar production and issues like that. But I would be very surprised if a Biden administration would really want to limit exports of oil and natural gas. It's something, frankly, President Obama was very proud of, that we're starting to do that, and I suspect that would continue.
Elizabeth, I'll get your take, and thank you, Mr. Ambassador. You covered both sides. If it's a Trump administration, if it's a Joe Biden administration. So thank you for that. Elizabeth, I'll let you weigh in on that. What do you think domestic oil and gas policy looks like, given the outcome of the election?
Well, assuming the first scenario, Trump is reelected and the Senate stays Republican, and so he's got some bandwidth, if you will, to back up his initiatives. The devil's really in the details. He can be all for a strong domestic energy industry, which is why we're here today, how to entertain these ideas and be change agents to create another strong domestic energy industry after what we've been through this year. But there are details that have to be changed at the Department of Energy to facilitate those markets. Now that natural gas is fungible through LNG, as Kathleen was saying, that is a huge potential market for American natural gas producers to export their natural gas, with but a blip on the radar screen as far as local manufacturing, domestic manufacturing. That's a red herring. That doesn't go anywhere. That it affects the price so much for our domestic manufacturers. We have so much natural gas that we would have to export so very much to affect the price here at home for manufacturers that that's almost inconceivable in the near future. But that being said, LNG is a very, very cost-intensive industry in the sunk costs in these LNG facilities. It's got a lot of catching up to do. We don't know when that's going to happen. 45 cargoes of LNG going out of America have been canceled for August. 30 cargoes have been canceled for September. They're taking a huge hit, just like everybody is. And so we're having a tremendous backup, and that's why the supply is and storage is going up, and the price is still not where it should be. But Trump is going to have to really take advantage of an opportunity if he gets this second term to make meaningful reforms for domestic oil and gas producers. And I must say that I have been underwhelmed by the care and feeding that the administration has given to the domestic natural gas and oil industry. I don't think he really understands it. He, he's pro-business, yes, but he also, he wants a cost of living, a very low cost of living for people who need cheap gasoline. And I believe that he did not understand the concept that, it can get too cheap. And by that time, you have lost a tremendous amount of American jobs and wealth and productivity, all for a couple of cents at the gasoline station when you fill up your car. I just don't think the president, because he's not from the industry, he's not from the part of the country, he's got a learning curve to get up to speed on what it's going to take to make us strong. And I hope he takes advantage of the second term to get really firmly ensconced as a pro-domestic energy president, even if it means coming down hard on Saudi Arabia. I don't think that's over yet. And the UAE, who worked with him on this peace plan. I do think that Biden, yeah.
Let me jump in right there, because I think you bring up some good points, and want to go back to Kathleen. Kathleen, one of the issues, and you kind of mentioned it in your opening, is that so for natural gas exports to happen and to make sure that all the natural gas that's being produced in the West Texas and the Permian is getting to market, we look at infrastructure, and we need pipelines, and there's so much resistance to that. Do you see that as a big barrier to, that supply that Elizabeth is talking about that could be gathered and exported? Is that infrastructure barrier, litigation, is that a problem going forward, kind of exporting LNG?
Well, I guess I'm maybe not as harsh as Elizabeth on the Trump administration or President Trump, because I think it would probably have taken any president a while to adjust to the fact that the United States is the #1 oil and natural gas producer. I mean, that's the first time that's happened, right? And so, we thought the United States was done in the 70s, right? So I think it is taking a while to get that balance between, oh yeah, it's great to have cheap prices at the pump, but as the #1 producer, that hurts the overall economy. So I think the fact that he's focused so much on regulation and NEPA, and he's done things on the pipelines from early on. So I think he does get the infrastructure angle of it. And I think that's really the most important thing for a Trump administration. I don't think probably as globally as Elizabeth and the ambassador do, but to me, it's that. So in my little parochial Western world, the biggest thing is getting some of those infrastructure things broken through. And because otherwise you get a Green New Deal, or I agree with Chris that, but Biden is more moderate than his campaign rhetoric. However, he's going to be pulled to the left, and he's not going to stand up to governors who are saying no infrastructure. And so we really will be in trouble if we can't get some infrastructure done, and some of that through the courts. So I think that's my primary focus for President Trump. Whether or not he takes on the Saudis is not as much of a concern for me.
Ambassador Hill, I want to ask you, thank you, Kathleen. Ambassador Hill, I want to ask you, when we talk about the Green New Deal, wouldn't the notion of America exporting clean natural gas as the foundational fuel for developing economies globally, isn't that a great Green New Deal for both administrations, whether it be a Trump or a Biden administration, to consider as we see, nations across the globe trying to emerge and trying to develop their economy to use clean natural gas as the foundation to do that? That would be fantastic, I would think.
I think you've answered your own question. It is fantastic, and I think it's something America does very well at, and I think we can do it competitively, especially if we do take care of some of these regulatory issues. So there's no question in my mind that would be part of any redefined Green New Deal. The new administration has a billion things to be thinking of, and don't forget these federal deficits are just unbelievable. Numbers that we've never seen in our history. So there's going to be a lot of focus on that, and I would be surprised if a new administration would be looking to limit exports of something. And so, even if it's not as green, as new, and as much of a deal as you say, I think any administration would want to do something about those exports. It's going to be, these are going to be tough times when you look at the overall, the deficits that will exist in terms of current account, but also the fiscal deficits. It's just, people have no idea what a sea of red we're swimming in right now.
Yeah, and we haven't even maybe seen the next round of stimulus, whether that's $1, $2, or $3 trillion. That's I agree with you. That's kind of mind blowing. I'll go back to Elizabeth and Kathleen on this, and especially Kathleen. I know that you work hand in hand with a lot of operators. How are they preparing and making plans around maybe a possible administration change? And I kind of want to throw this notion out with that answer, and that is, given this penchant for administrations to use executive order to try and legislate, and we think about that day one fracking ban, and a lot of people say, well, that would only be on federal land. I kind of see, maybe trying to find some sort of something within the EPA to try and do an executive order kind of couched in that to avoid it. How are your producers planning around the possible outcomes and maybe this executive order action on day one?
Well, I'm actually not too scared about an executive order on day one. I think there might be one, just as a sop to the left, but I think there'd be a recognition that that is going to fail in court, and we would be in court the next day if a fracking ban on federal lands or a leasing ban on federal lands was attempted via executive order. I know API would be doing so if a fracking ban was proposed nationwide. So those would fail in court. So those don't really scare me. But what I think we'd see is Obama-Biden times 11 with the new Biden administration, because the rhetoric is so much more vitriolic. I think we would see, and we survived it, right? We did the overregulation. We engaged in just hundreds of regulatory actions meant to trip up the industry. And we'll see more of that, plus the added goal of, they have to be making progress towards net zero. So I'm not as optimistic as Chris is on, the moderation of the Biden administration, but I think he makes a good point in the moderating impacts of the situation that we're in. So we would see, though, agencies full of really smart people from the Clinton and the Obama agencies, and they know how to do death by 1,000 cuts.
Elizabeth, I'll let you weigh in on that, and then we'll talk Russia, OPEC, and OPEC plus.
Okay, I want to go back a little bit, weighing in on your question about executive orders and fracking ban day one if Biden is elected. I agree with Kathleen perfectly. I couldn't say it any better. That does not keep me up at night, that fracking ban on day one. But I do believe that the rhetoric, and we don't know who's actually funding his campaign, who his biggest donors are, who's creating those talking points for him, and who is actually, if he's the old Joe Biden that he used to be, I don't think that he would be entertaining something so provocative and dramatic as a fracking ban, which effectively is a way to implement the leave it in the ground policy that the AOCs of the Congress want, and the extreme liberal environmentalists want. The whole policy is to leave it in the ground. And how do you do that? You ban fracking. But it is the pull from the left that influences small changes incrementally that really are just a death by 1,000 cuts for an industry, if you will. And how to shore up the renewable, quote, sustainable that are in their scope. And so right now, renewables, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that, they're renewables really, although there has been an uptick in generation, solar voltaic and wind certainly, but it's not economic now, no matter what you do with natural gas at the price it is, and increased natural gas electric generation going on right now. They cannot compete. So they have to do to the rest what they've done to coal, which is to make natural gas, not electric generation by natural gas, non-economic. And so I think it's more, pardon my, I hope I'm not being politically incorrect, but I think we used to call it as kids the Chinese water torture. I mean, you're just little by little, you're taking over the space that really entrepreneurs and free markets where they don't want to go. I just want to go back a little bit to what Kathleen said about NEPA and NEPA reform and what's going on at the Department of Energy that I have recently been aware of, and how it affects new technologies, and how the prices, the costs that it adds to LNG facilities. And for instance, you have a new technology, a new natural gas shipping technology, which was developed by Texas company C1 Maritime, which creates compressed gas liquid that can be sent in small ships to nearby countries in the Caribbean, South America. Well, this is not natural gas. It can't go in a natural gas pipeline. It cannot be treated like natural gas, and yet DOE took jurisdiction of this as if it were natural gas. And the Natural Gas Act has to be brought up to date to embrace new technologies so that we can get other natural gas products other than just liquefied natural gas out of the country. I would be for complete removal of federal oversight and let the states where the LNG facilities are, EPA, OSHA, all the other agencies that have jurisdiction over these manufacturing facilities of LNG, I would suggest that the quickest and easiest and cheapest way so that we can have an economic advantage or a level playing field with other countries that are shipping out natural gas, so our natural gas can go out and we can be very, very competitive on the global stage. I would suggest that we don't need the massive federal oversight, including the FERC and the DOE, that it takes, the multi-millions of dollars of lawyers and engineers that it takes to be compliant with NEPA and to get one of these sites built. And then, yeah. So
No,
anyway,
say,
yes, reform to NEPA.
Yeah, that is a great suggestion, and certainly, within the Trump administration, kind of regulatory reform and kind of weeding back some of the overbearing. And I don't think any of us are advocates. I don't think any of us are advocates for the reducing, the environmental responsibility
impact statements
that taken on. So yeah, that's a great suggestion.
He's got to go farther.
Yeah, I agree. Just to shift gears real quick, Ambassador Hill, I'll come back to you. How should, if you were advising whether after the election it's President Trump for another 4 years or whether it's President Biden, how would you advise them to deal with Russia, OPEC, and OPEC Plus if another one of these price wars break out? What would you advise them on day one to say, if this happens again, these are the steps that you should take?
I mean, they really, the Trump administration really came at the Saudis to try to slow that down. They even threw in the issue of military assistance, or supposedly did. I think some approach like that is necessary, but I think President Trump needs to understand that these are not our friends, whether it's Russians or Saudis. These are countries doing things in their own interest. And I would try to make the case a little more to him that Saudi Arabia, they get in these spats with their OPEC Plus country, but it's really, they're coming after us. I mean, we're the #1 producer. And so I think the president needs to have to understand that better. And I think for a lot of people of a certain age, and I put Trump in that category, I certainly put Joe Biden in that category, just have trouble coming to grips with the idea that we're the #1 oil producer. And but I think the Saudis have understood it very well. And I think the Russians have understood it, and they just come after us day and night, and usually out of spite. And I think the president has a tendency to be a little soft with those countries, and I think he has to come at them harder. Now, obviously, the president is very pleased with what happened today with UAE and Israel. By the way, there are some details there that need to be sorted out. And clearly, if UAE did that, it was because the Saudis went along to some degree. So I think right now it's a hard time to make a case for the president being tougher on the Saudis. He'll lean the other way. But I think in the fullness of time, he needs to understand that there's no, you do something for them and don't expect them to come back and do it for you. With respect to Biden, I think he has a lot more trust in the intelligence community to report on what's really going on. I think he has a lot more trust in having sort of organizations dealing with this problem, and he'll get on the phone at a certain point, but he won't start with the phone. So I think in terms of kind of managing this Saudi and probably Russian pushback against our industry, I don't think he will need a pep talk on that. But I think we do need to kind of stop thinking that everything is related to one another. And I think the president got himself into a little trouble with the Saudis by buying into all their stuff about Iran. I mean, no one likes Iran. I don't like Iran, but that's not why we need to do things with Saudi Arabia.
Ambassador, thank you for bringing up Iran. I've always thought, and I'll get everybody's opinion on this. What do you think? I suspect that the Trump administration is not looking to lift sanctions on Iran and Venezuela anytime soon, and that's a lot of oil and a lot of oil production that's sitting in the penalty box. What do you think the Biden administration would do with respect to those sanctions on countries that their oil is basically sitting in sanctions in the penalty box?
I don't think you'll see any real change in the Venezuelan policy. I think Biden administration would be pretty relentless with Venezuela. And by the way, I'm not sure that regime is there for the long run if you look at their internal financial issues. So I think it'll probably be pedal to the metal with Venezuela. I think what people need to understand is when most people in Washington look at Iran, they don't see an oil issue, they see a nuclear issue. And the question is, how can you best deal with that nuclear issue? And I think the locus of opinion among people who really know these nuclear negotiations. I mean, I spent 4 years dealing with the North Korean one. I put that in a somewhat different category from Iran, but I think probably you'll see a Biden administration want to get back to a JCPOA POA plus. That is, throw in some regional issues to the equation, talk about their missile production. But I don't think you'll see the attitude to Iran really conditioned by the issue of oil supplies. I think you'll see a lot of it with nuclear, and then the rest of it with our allies in Europe, who are very worried about the direction we're going with.
Yeah, I'll ask Kathleen and Elizabeth, any thoughts on sanctioned oil in Iran and Venezuela, and what happens to U.S. producers if any of that kind of comes online?
I'll
Well, I
defer.
think it's,
to Elizabeth on that
go on,
one.
Kathleen.
No, I was just saying I would defer to you.
Well, I think it is something that's worth thinking about if it were to come to pass and if Biden is elected. The life of the renewable energy, whether it's wind or solar, I'll just lump them in together, depends on, and natural gas fueled electric plants. A lot of this depends on the price of, crude and natural gas. And a cheap crude oil on the market that translates into very cheap gasoline, that translates into people driving bigger cars, filling them up more often, moving in them, is obviously a deterrent to mass transportation, fuel switching to solar voltaics and wind for electric generation. So if Biden, he's got it's kind of a double-edged sword for him to release the Iranian crude oil from its bondage and let it out on the world stage, obviously makes or could potentially, if you think about it dynamically, will make a market of cheaper crude oil. It'll lower prices, lower gasoline at the pump, and in fact, incentivize all those evil things like driving in a gasoline powered vehicle with a combustion engine. So keeping it in bondage, if you will, corralled back at home in Iran, except for the black market, and they're shipping it out if they can, other than that. But keeping it there, actually driving the price up, helps the renewable compete with the hydrocarbon. So it's a balancing act, I guess. How do you keep your people, your left wing, your left flank happy But then how, again, do you operate on the world stage? And so if he is put in a box by his left flank, he's going to be a different president than the president that he will be if he can think on his own 2 feet. I think it's going to be interesting to watch how it unfolds if he's elected.
Yeah, we maybe have time for a couple more questions, but this one I definitely wanted to cover, and that is, you know, I grew up, I was a kid in the 70s, you know, got my license in the early 80s. And I remember, you know, kind of being in the family station wagon when the oil embargo hit in the 70s and how dependent we were on foreign oil. And I feel like maybe that has left the consciousness of Americans. Is it important for us to really care about our energy independence anymore? And Kathleen, I'll kick it off to you, and I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
I was in that same station wagon, I think.
Yeah, no, I was in it too.
Oh, okay. You know, it's kind of funny that kids that are decades younger than we, who weren't ever in a station wagon, who grew up in minivans instead, still have some of that psyche. And, you know, I just don't think the country has come to grips with the fact that we're a major oil and natural gas. I still run into people when I talk about what I do and mention that. They're just flabbergasted. Oh, I didn't know that. I mean, a lot of people just don't really know how much of an engine of this economy oil and natural gas is. So, yeah, I don't think it's just the president it's just our psyche still hasn't come to grips with it. And then when you have so many people saying that, I mean, at the start of the Obama administration, oil and gas was roadkill in the rear view mirror, right? Do you remember? We were going to be on all renewables in 10 years. And then the shale revolution happened, right? And now we're seeing that same type of rhetoric. It's reformulated. It's not, you know, we're going to be off wind, you know, we're going to be totally wind and solar in 10 years. Now we're going to be net zero by 2035. So the rhetoric has changed, but the policies haven't. And if anything, they've doubled down on it. So I don't think people generally learned that renewables haven't taken over, not because of evil policies from people like me, but because wind and solar just simply don't do everything that oil, natural gas, and coal do. They're not scalable. They're not 24/7. So people are still being fed a diet of misinformation from the environmental lobby and from the left that it's just, I mean, the Greta Thunberg phenomenon is totally that, you know, if only we had the right policies in place, you know, we could be net zero. So we're seeing that same cycle again. And I'm really heartened that Ambassador Hill is seeing a moderating force in President or Vice President Biden. But I'm not sure that he really is going to withstand that as much. So I guess we'd have to see.
Well, yeah, and we only have a few more minutes left for our panel. Just want to get your thoughts, Elizabeth. You certainly looked like you wanted to weigh in on whether it's important for us to be energy independent here in America.
Well, I would say it's very important to be energy secure. I mean, you know, even if we could grow all the crops that we wanted, doesn't mean we don't want to import some things sometime from some countries who are our friends. But having the option of whether we want to or not, do we have to import because we can't produce enough energy here at home? Well, no, we don't. We don't have to have it. We might want to. Might want traders to be able to send cargo ships and buy them in real time and buy at a spot price of crude oil. But we don't have to if we don't want to. And that is what gives us energy security. And we can be independent if we want. We wouldn't necessarily. We'd import from Mexico. We'd import from Canada. We'd import from, but we'd have options. And options, to me, are the hallmark of a free country, and markets that can work are the hallmark of our republic. And so I have faith in the market to decide, and people can nibble around the edges all they want, but in the end, the market will prevail. That electricity that's going to fuel your Tesla is going to be natural gas fueled electricity. So it's a natural gas fueled car. And I'm all for Teslas, and I can't wait to get one. And we're putting fueling stations in our nearby town, but it's going to be natural gas fired Tesla. And that is exciting. And that gives us even more options to not import from anyone, anywhere, if we don't want to. So, you know, I like the term energy security.
That well said, well said. Ambassador Hill, close us out with your thoughts, if you would.
Well, first of all, I just want to, 1,000% put myself behind what Elizabeth said in differentiating the issue of independence from security, because I don't really care if we get some vital supply from Canada, because I have full faith that Canada will ship it to the U.S. I don't think it really matters. Where I think our country needs to give some thought to this is an issue that you brought up a few minutes ago, and that was sanctions. Because I think this idea that every time a country looks at us crossways and we think, well, we're going to sanction that country, that's a day when people have less faith in the capacity to have secure trade with the U.S., because you never know when the U.S. is going to politicize this. I think to some extent, rather ironically, President Trump has played into this, because I think there is a concern that you cannot really rely on trade with the U.S. because you don't know what we're going to do next, whether it's sanctions, whether it's some kind of tariffs, whether it's a sort of basically assault on the idea of free trade, saying that somehow we've been cheated, and some very generalized concept that somehow countries have taken advantage of us, and by golly, we're going to get back at them. So I hope Americans kind of think a little about what is going to make us the most successful trading country in the world, and we've been that in the past. And we need to look very hard at this issue of politicizing trade, whether through sanctions or other means.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. I kind of figured when we were setting up this panel that we could probably talk all day. As you guys know, I still have a whole laundry list of questions that we could have gone over. But unfortunately, we're out of time. But I just want to thank you, Kathleen and Elizabeth and Ambassador Hill, for joining us and for being a part of Intercom's The Oil and Gas Conference. Really do appreciate your time, and really do appreciate your thoughts on these subjects. You guys have a great day, and we appreciate you joining us.
And a pleasure.
Thank you.